Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've got more than 100 participants, so I think that's a good threshold to trigger the commencement of the proceedings. My name is Ju Chong Tan. I'm the director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands upon which we meet and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to record that sovereignty was never ceded by the First Nations of this country. I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar. It's really quite tremendous to see quite a great turnout. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome you to this event because it's actually co-hosted by the Electoral Regulation Research Network and the Gilbert and Tobin Center for Public Law. While we are, of course, living through in terms of the pandemic, and it has become a bit of a truism to say this, that this pandemic throws up novel and complex challenges to the way we work, the way we live, and to the point of this seminar, to the way in which elections are conducted and held. And it's the abiding tenet of the Electoral Regulation Research Network that it is really through greater public deliberation, increased public discussion of the challenges that this Australia and society can more effectively meet the unprecedented nature of the issues posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're tremendously privileged today to have two speakers that have been happy to share their insights into elections and campaigning in the pandemic. Tom Rogers, who's the Australian Electoral Commissioner, and Paul Erickson, the National Secretary of the Australian Labor Party. And I should note here that Andrew Hurst, the Secretary of the Liberal Party, was unable to make this event and conveys his apologies to the gathering at large. After this very brief introduction, let me just outline the format of this event. Tom will speak first for around half an hour. Paul will then follow to speak around 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll have time for questions and discussions. With questions and discussions, can I ask that you put your questions or all comments into the chat room? And what I'll do after Tom and Paul have spoken is put those questions and comments to them for their reactions. And I should just note too that this event is being recorded. What's being recorded are essentially Paul, Tom, and myself speaking, and of course the questions that I'll be relating to them. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom Rogers, the Australian Electoral Commissioner.
Well, hi everybody. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm now going to try and share that with you, so just bear with me as we get that technology right. And Ju Chong, perhaps you can confirm that, righto, well look, we're underway. Let me also add my acknowledgement onto Ju Chong's of the traditional custodians of the land and their elders past and present. And may I also thank you for attending today to hear about our own experiences with running a by-election in the middle of a pandemic. And I know there'll be some other practitioners here today who have either also just run elections in the middle of a pandemic or at some point over the next period will be doing so. Who would have thought that we would have had to have done that even at the start of the year? And it has been an interesting experience for us, and it's taught us a lot, particularly about agility. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move through, but in line with our values, being adaptable and being able to change with challenging environments is critical. We found that even as we were trying to do the planning for the election, pandemic restrictions were changing even in the middle of the planning process, and it became very difficult. And what may or may not be known, it's a federal electoral event. We delivered it in New South Wales, and the count occurred in the ACT. So we actually had to make sure that we were adhering to the regulations from the Commonwealth, New South Wales and the ACT governments, and work extensively with agencies across those three jurisdictions. That added a layer of complexity that we weren't expecting, and I might talk about that a bit as we move through. So today this is our story. I know that there are many others who are either planning or just done. I know that a huge election has just occurred in the NT, and it'll be great, I think, for all of us at a point in time to collectively learn lessons from what occurred in each of those jurisdictions, not just us or Queensland or the NT, but together working out what worked, what didn't work, and what we need to do as we move forward. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about our experiences today. So I think what we might do is I might talk about some straight up statistics. I'll talk about the COVID safety measures in place during polling and for the count. I want to talk about some of the lessons that we learned. Agility, which I mentioned before, addressing the issue of voter anxiety, which is something that really we had to focus on in a great way. The digital delivery of information, and the other impacts of a COVID sort of safe election, what we learned from that and how we had to adapt some products very quickly to be able to deliver it. So that's kind of where I want to head. And of course, I always find that the richest discussion occurs in questions, and I'm happy to answer any question that people might have. And just before I start with the statistics, I did want to make one point about the political parties. Sometimes political parties get a bad rap. And I have to tell you, our experience is that by and large, particularly all the major parties, want to do the right thing. And again, I wanted to praise the political parties for the way that they behaved during this by-election, during the pandemic. Collectively, I think it's a collective responsibility for all of us to make sure that we're looking after citizens, and I can absolutely tell you that that was the case. Doesn't mean there are not minor disagreements here and there along the way, but everyone involved in the by-election worked particularly well, so I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. All right. So first of all, some statistics, and as it says there, we had about 114,000 enrolled electors. The by-election turnout, as it says there, was 89.13%. It's really interesting, given it was in the middle of a pandemic. That's, if we go back over 10 years, there's only been one by-election with a higher turnout. And I think, someone might correct me here, that was Bennelong. I know Braddon it might have been, sorry, in 2018, which had a turnout of 90.38%. So actually, that turnout is pretty good. You know, going back 10 years, the most we've had other than from that other by-election. And we also had a big increase in the number of polling places. We were worried about how people were going to vote, and so there was an increase in the number of polling places. We had 71 static polling places and 13 pre-polls. So that was an increase of about 6 additional static polling places and 5 additional pre-poll polling places. So there was a big increase in service, and I'll talk later on. One of the things we were worried about is the queuing that could have occurred as a result of the extra safety measures we put in place. So we ran a campaign with extra polling places to ensure that citizens would not be denied their voice. One of the other things that occurred, though, as a result of the pandemic is we couldn't do any mobile polling. So normally we would visit old folks' homes and certain hospitals. We couldn't do any of that. We worked very, very closely with those entities to make sure that no one was denied the chance to vote. And we appointed a special member of staff here who worked with each individual institution in Eden-Monaro that would have normally received mobile polling to make sure that no one missed out on that. Not surprisingly, there was a difference in the voting behaviour of the public. And if I put that up, I'm hoping these slides are turning. Jushong, I can see you if you can. Yes, great. So we can see there, probably no surprises, that we received more postal vote applications and more completed postal votes and more pre-poll votes than at a federal election and the last federal election. But the number of ordinary votes on the day was down. And I don't think there's any surprises there. We predicted that, and we tried to make sure that we had resources in place to deal with that. And as I'll talk later on, we ran a heavy campaign for the public called Plan Your Vote. And it was deliberate strategy to get people to think about how they were going to vote in the middle of a pandemic. Again, getting the franchise out for us is critical, and we wanted to make sure that everyone understood exactly what it was, what the service offering was. Interestingly, more than double the number of postal votes received than during the 2019 federal election. Again, no surprises with that. But I do wonder about the implications of that for the next federal event, not only for the next federal event, but for elections moving forward. And Juchong, I certainly wouldn't want to be involved in criticising, or not criticising, but even talking about what might be happening in other jurisdictions. But we see the issue of postal votes becoming a huge issue overseas right now. We in Australia, in all the jurisdictions, have a very long history of successfully enabling the franchise through postal voting. But it is interesting to see that rapid increase in postal votes for this event. And again, it's something we had planned for, but certainly the numbers were even a bit surprising for us. If I go to pre-poll votes and on the day votes, you can see that there was an increase in pre-poll, not to the same extent as postal, but certainly an increase, and then a decrease on the day. And I do wonder whether part of that was that we really got citizens to focus on that idea of planning their vote. We pointed out what might be the issues on polling day to make sure that people were aware of all of the issues they might have to confront, and then we didn't encourage pre-poll voting, we didn't encourage postal voting, but we did get people to really dwell on the issue of how to cast a successful vote in the middle of a pandemic. All right, so that's kind of the broad statistics. And now I thought I'd just perhaps quickly talk about some of the COVID safety measures that we introduced, first of all on polling day. Now, hopefully you can see a photo there of one of the many polling places. You can see that people are maintaining those distances pretty well. And by and large, by the way, the public were excellent. There was hardly any complaint about any of the measures that we put in place. We did spend a lot of time explaining it to them, but they were very, very compliant. We did have extra queue controllers inside and outside the polling places to help people, remind them about the 1.5 metre distancing. And I think for the first time, certainly in my time in the AEC, we hired security guards for the outsides of each of the polling places to again assist and remind people of the 1.5 metres. But it was, by and large, people were self-regulating. Our staff were provided masks, but we did not force them to wear masks. Hand sanitizer was made available at the entrance and exit of each polling place. And we also developed a suite of training videos focused on health and safety. And perhaps just at the end, I might talk about what we did with that. You can see there in that photo, we also had sneeze shields with those very nifty maps of Australia as the footer for those sneeze shields. And we got 150,000 small, those Kino style pencils for single-use pencils. So we encouraged people to take the pencil with them or to bring their own writing implement, not to leave that in the polling place. We had a hygiene officer who regularly sanitised desks, shields and polling screens. And we blocked off a large number of the polling booths, as you can see there where it says do not use, to make sure that we're actually mandating that 1.5 metre distance. So all of that worked in our view pretty well. And we did some tests. So just put that up there. People may have noticed in some of the media reports that we used plain cardboard rather than the branded cardboard that we normally use. It's been a long time coming for the AEC. It is an environmental measure and also has a cost saving. Of course, as these things occur, just at the time when finally we implemented it without coating on the polling booths, we had to sanitise each of the booths in between voters, and the coating would have helped with that a bit. But nonetheless, we had plastic sleeves that we put in, we had hygiene officers, and they sprayed those screens in between each voter. They sprayed the Perspex shields, and we really took that very, very consciously. The plastic sleeves were a great solution to ensure the longevity of the cardboard equipment. I know that sounds so minor, and I know I'm down into the weeds, but for us, the money and planning involved in that is huge. So it's something we took extra care of, did a lot of planning before the event and a lot of testing to see what would and would not work. And then I might go to the COVID safe health measures during the count. Now, the count was probably the more difficult issue. We did use, as you can see from this slide during the count, Perspex shields. And in fact, the two staff you see looking at the camera there are actually part of our legal team who volunteered to participate in the event. They love the count, which they do each time. We had sanitizer, face masks. We encouraged scrutineers to wear face masks as well. Like most count centres, it was a fairly huge space, but it was barely big enough as we had a vast number of scrutineers that turned up. Obviously, it was a election that people were highly interested in and of the outcome, and so the parties had a number of scrutineers. We had to work with the parties to ensure that COVID-safe measures were in place. And I think if I go there, you can see some of the count. We did have sneeze shields on the end of the tables, on the sides of the tables, and we did our very best to ensure that staff and scrutineers were safe. And again, if you can see there, that's the sort of, gives you a picture down the line of the count centre with sneeze shields at every table, sanitizer, and a range of equipment available for staff. I'll talk at the end about the cost of that. This is something we're all going to have to think about as we move forward, and even the procurement of the equipment that we used. So broadly, there were several lessons that we learned, and I'll just put that slide up, talk briefly to it, and then I'll whip through a couple of those lessons and then maybe draw that to a conclusion. So it wasn't just the pandemic. I'll slide to the next slide and come back. It was also bushfires. The seat of Eden-Monaro had unprecedented damage from bushfires earlier in the year, and many hundreds of homes were lost in that seat. So we had to take account of not only the pandemic, but the damage that had already been wrought through the bushfires. And what we found was there was immense value, as it says there, engaging with government departments across jurisdictions. Now, and it wasn't just the health agencies, and I might just give you a picture of what we had to do to be able to run the by-election. I had to seek the permission, and these very unusual things, we don't normally do this at a federal election, of the New South Wales, the Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Education to give us approval to use the schools. And they imposed, quite rightly, special conditions on us. We had to do a deep cleanse of all the polling places after the day. We had to write to the New South Wales Minister for Local Government to seek his intercession with some of the local councils to enable us to use the school halls. They were rightly very worried. I went and saw and worked closely with the New South Wales Police Commissioner to ensure that his police weren't going to prevent either scrutineering or party volunteers from handing out how-to votes, and that was a legal activity. I had to get special permission from the New South Wales Minister for Health, because it was a declared pandemic, that we were legally able to run the election in that jurisdiction. I worked closely with the head of the Bushfire Recovery Agency and Resilience New South Wales to make sure that we could access their networks to reach into those communities that had been heavily impacted by the bushfires, to make sure they were aware of the options for them to vote. We were particularly keen on that. Some of those individuals had lost their homes and their livelihoods. We didn't want them to lose their voice as well, so we took extra care to work with that community. I rang the head of Australia Post personally, Christine Holgate, to ensure that there'd be no disruption to the delivery of postal votes. We also spoke to the Chief Medical Officer of the Commonwealth, the Chief Health Officer in New South Wales, and the Chief Medical Officer in the ACT, and we took those individuals out to a mock polling place we set up and a mock count centre to ensure they were comfortable with the measures that we put in place. That's an extraordinary level, and I've only just scratched the surface with that small snapshot, an extraordinary level of involvement with other agencies to make sure that we could lawfully deliver the election and do it in a safe way. Next issue is voter anxiety, and we ran a very, very proactive media campaign, which I'll go through in a moment, to talk to the community about the fact that they would be safe to vote. And we tried to do as much as we could proactively to let people know that it was safe to vote and the measures that we would put in place. Now, what we didn't say, though, is it's totally safe, because no one can say that. We explained the measures we had in place and again asked people to plan their vote. We used it as an opportunity to develop and then deliver new training material. And for us, that was really worked well. We were very satisfied with what we did. We put in place some excellent COVID training packages at very short notice, and I'm very proud of the staff for the way that they did that. And then, as I've got at the bottom there, the impact of COVID safety election delivery was the cost. And there was a cost to doing it, and it was difficult to get all the equipment, and I'll finish off with that as we get there today. So, first of all, public awareness. We ran our Stop and Consider campaign, which we have run previously. People remember, I think I've even briefed Juchong ERRN on that previously, which is about checking the source at electoral events, and we continued to do that. We ran a very heavy public awareness campaign about the COVID safety measures. We explained what we would be doing. We used multimedia, and it worked pretty well. I think on the screen there you'll see we ran a public awareness survey after the event. 85% of people were aware of the health measures we had in place. We really did pump it as part of a community confidence regime. And 3/4 of the voters said to us that they felt safer as a result of the publicity that we gave the measures and the measures that they saw in place when they turned out to vote. And the great thing is that it did not have the impact on queuing that we thought it was going to have. And I think largely because of the way in which we conducted the polling, but also the patience of the electors, and then, of course, statistically, the big increase in postals and in pre-poll voting really helped with that. For us, that was very successful, and we've learned some real lessons about what works and what does not work in times of pandemic with reaching out to the public. We are already really active with social media in any case, and that was no different for Eden-Monaro. We've got a couple of great staff in our social media team who have been really good at reaching out to the public, allaying concerns, and also providing appropriate yet strong responses when misinformation is put on social media. That has worked really well for us as well. The digital training I mentioned before, as you can see there, we used QR codes to assist people, a range of new technologies that we put in place, and tried to adapt our training as much as we can to ensure that people understood their obligations to deliver a COVID-safe election. And by the way, we've also provided whatever materials we can to our other jurisdictional colleagues in the states and territories for their assistance with running their elections. And likewise, we also got help from Queensland and others in putting our material together. So it's this great circle of sharing, which is exactly the way it should be. And I'm hoping some of our experiences will help people with that. We also, just out of interest, have been working closely with Deakin University, who have been assisting us looking at the metrics for polling, what works and what doesn't work with queuing, and how to conduct queuing in a more efficient way. And then we engaged them in Eden-Monaro to look at the impact of the pandemic-related measures on the flow-through of polling places. Ladies and gentlemen, you're probably aware that queuing has become this huge issue in the minds of the Australian voter, and we largely got it cracked at the last election. In 2016, we got really hit hard by complaints about queuing, even though 75% of people were through in under 15 minutes, but it's become such an issue that we really focus on that experience. It cost us, as it says there, about 200,000 extra for the PPE related equipment at the Eden-Monaro by-election. Even if you factor in economies of scale, if we are required to do something similar at the next federal event, the cost of the federal election, I think, will be significantly greater. And the cost that you see on the screen in front of you is only the cost for the PPE. It doesn't account for the additional cost we had to pay for additional premises the storage of the PPE, the extra logistics we needed to transport all of that equipment around, the additional staff we hired for queue control, sanitisation, and the larger premises that we had as well. Normal cost for a by-election, you know, round about $2 million. The ultimate cost of this when it's finished will be significantly more than that as a result of those issues. So I only say that because at a full election, I think the costs, if we are required to do something similar, will be a quantum above where we were last time. So for us, the election went really well. We think that the administration was about as good as we could make it. Excuse me. And we've learned a number of lessons that we'll take forward into the next federal election, including the fact that our digital delivery of training, which was already highly digital anyway, I think we've been so successful in delivering that, will change again the way in which we do business with that. And the need to work effectively with all of our jurisdictional stakeholders, including state government authorities in the time of a pandemic, is something that we've certainly adapted to. I'm really proud of the work of our staff. We changed a number of times on the way through as the pandemic restrictions changed. We were adaptable and flexible, and I'm very satisfied with the manner in which our staff delivered, I thought, a very good event, and one that was rated very well by citizens, which is what it's all about. So, Juchong, I think I might leave it there. I think that's our overarching lessons from the by-election. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy at question time to take those.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing those insights. And I think, I think the focus on lessons learned on what seems to be a positive handling of the election in the pandemic, I think will be valued by many. And can I encourage the participants too, I'm sure some of you got questions or comments, just pop them in the chat, and then we'll pick up on those questions or comments after Paul finishes up his presentation. Paul, on to you.
Thanks, Juchong. Thank you for the invitation to present today. And also thank you, Tom, for your presentation and for all of the AEC's efforts in Eden-Monaro. I do wish to echo your the broad sort of commentary you've offered about the event, the experience of having to engage in a by-election under pandemic conditions, and the work that the AEC did along with the other relevant authorities to make sure that it was a success. I only intend to make some brief remarks today, and I've got sort of three observations that I wanted to make, which relate to the impact that COVID-19 had on the electorate and how voters engaged in the by-election, the impact on the conduct of the by-election and campaigning by candidates and political parties, and lastly, just some observations about the spread of disinformation online. So all topics that Tom's presentation went to, and hopefully I can add something valuable too. So self-evidently, the key thing about the Eden-Monaro by-election was it occurred in circumstances that were quite different to recent general elections and federal by-elections. The outbreak of the pandemic in the weeks leading up to the by-election had a number of effects on voters, in no particular order. The closure of non-essential businesses and a loss of working hours, or in some cases the impact of sudden employment, really reshaped the public debate and changed voter perceptions about the issues that were at stake in the by-election. The wall-to-wall media coverage of the pandemic meant that the by-election occurred in a very different media environment to typical political campaigns. The restrictions on private and public gatherings, as well as commercial activity and time spent outside the home, transformed lifestyles and media consumption habits, particularly in the first half of the campaign. As the Commissioner noted in his presentation, voter anxiety, the fear of contracting COVID, left many voters in a pretty fearful and anxious state, which made campaign contact from candidates or from volunteers operating on their behalf less welcome than it would normally have been. And those effects, as well as others, there'd be many others that people could point to, were very much acutely felt at the time when Mike Kelly, the former member, announced his resignation on the 30th of April 2020. However, there's a fair bit of evidence through sort of publicly available opinion polling, as well as a lot of the data that that's publicly available about community and business activity, that from early May onwards, Australians' concerns about the coronavirus itself had begun to taper off. And by about mid-May, concern with the economy and the economic impact of the virus had started to eclipse worries about the direct health effects of the virus itself. And the number of voters who were reporting that they'd been directly impacted by some of the social effects of the virus and of the lockdowns had begun to dissipate for the first time. So people reporting experiencing feelings of social isolation or food shortages, mental health issues or arguments and tensions at home. From about mid-May onwards, those started to drift back down. So in short, essentially the campaign commenced at a moment where private and public life was beginning to open back up again after the cascading restrictions that state and federal governments rolled out over the course of March. And the by-election as a whole essentially occurred in an environment where that trajectory of opening up applied. So just within New South Wales, restrictions were eased at 3 points over the course of the campaign. On the 15th of May, restrictions on public and private gatherings in New South Wales were eased. People were allowed to have 5 people into the home. Freestanding cafes and restaurants operating inside pubs and clubs were allowed to open up for limited sit-down dining after being restricted originally to takeaway only from the 23rd of March onwards. On the 13th of June, there was a further lifting of restrictions where private homes were allowed to have up to 20 guests. Groups of 20 were allowed to gather and congregate outside. And then on the 1st of July, there was a further lifting of restrictions. So the observation I would make, I suppose the first point would be that notwithstanding the merits of everything that Tom presented on, I think we should, I think it is worth observing and reflecting on the fact that COVID-19 had less of an effect on the election as an electoral event than we might have expected. I'm glad Tom made those points about turnout earlier, because that was the sort of indicator I was going to point to as sort of evidence of that. Initially, our assumptions in the ALP had been that if you look over the last decade, in federal by-elections that have been contested by both major parties, and there haven't been sort of circumstances where one or other party hasn't offered voters a candidate, turnout has generally been around 8 percentage points lower than it was at the previous general election. And we'd looked at that fact and at the experience of our Queensland colleagues in the March 2020 local government elections and state by-elections, which occurred at the end of March, and made an assumption at the beginning of the campaign that voter turnout would fall by something in the order of 8 to 10 percentage points. And that didn't materialise, as was shown earlier. In the end, 89.1% of eligible voters cast a ballot. That was a reduction of only 4.2% compared to the 2019 general election for the district of Eden-Monaro. Now, there'll be very many reasons for that, and I recognise and want to place on the record that all of the efforts that the Electoral Commission went to make sure that voters were aware of their options and were able to cast a vote in a manner that they felt safe to do so, that was relatively frictionless, deserve the lion's share of the credit for that fact. But what it also points to for me was that day-to-day life in Eden-Monaro in late June and early July, in the period in which voting was occurring, is actually in my view, much closer to the normal course of business pre-COVID than it was to life during April, when voters in Eden-Monaro were subject to much heavier restrictions. And I've been down in Melbourne for the last 7 weeks for family reasons. I can tell you that life in May and June and the beginning of July in Eden-Monaro was much more liberal than life for me over the last 6 or 7 weeks has been. So while we did experience a COVID campaign, particularly in the early stages, I think it is worth framing the experience as perhaps not quite being a COVID election, and we shouldn't assume that we've seen the worst. One day we may face circumstances where we have to make a choice about whether and how to proceed with an election whilst a highly infectious, deadly disease is spreading amongst the voters who are eligible to vote in that by-election. And in Eden-Monaro, on the 4th of July, in essence, that wasn't the case. So I think that's just worth reflecting on in terms of the lessons. The second point I wanted to make was just some reflections on the experience of political parties, candidates and campaigners in how we engaged in the electoral process. During May and June, the ALP was invited to participate in discussions with the New South Wales Health Department and each of the other parties who were expected to nominate candidates for Eden-Monaro. Those discussions were auspiced by the Chief Health Officer in New South Wales and were triggered in part by some of the intergovernmental processes that Tom's presentation covered off earlier. And they were framed to us as an opportunity for the health authorities to solicit feedback from political parties on how COVID-19 restrictions might intersect with electoral campaigning. The output of those discussions was a document titled COVID-19 Safety Considerations for Political Campaign Staff and Volunteers, which was issued by the New South Wales Chief Health Officer on the 17th of June. Those discussions were conducted in good faith, and I think that they were a very positive initiative. And for full disclosure, due to events relating to the Victorian branch of the ALP that came to public attention on the 14th, I was not personally an active participant in the final stages of the discussion because I had to spend a couple of days attending to some other matters. But the view that the ALP put was that one or both of the New South Wales health authorities or the Electoral Commission, within all of their relevant powers, needed to set clear rules that candidates, parties and volunteers could follow. And those rules should be set with the principle in mind that political campaigning needs to adjust to follow public health guidance, not the other way around. Political parties in the sort of chaotic environment of an electoral campaign and in an environment where there essentially is no first mover advantage, can't be expected to negotiate voluntary agreements on how to limit campaigning during the campaign, and voluntary guidelines will be of little effect. So as I said, we were satisfied with all of the engagement and thought that the process was very thorough and led to some good outcomes. But an observation I would make looking back is that it really is, I think, appropriate for authorities to set the parameters within the powers that they have, and for parties, candidates and campaigners to then have to respond to that. The third remark I just wanted to make, which I'll just take the opportunity to do, given that I've got the audience today. It's not COVID related, but it's just an observation about the continued dissemination of disinformation online that we're seeing, and the impact that has on political campaigns. So as was widely reported, and I'm sure the observers of the seminar today would be aware, the ALP candidate, Christy McBain, was the target of a malicious campaign spreading false and quite defamatory claims via email throughout the by-election campaign. The repetitive and regular nature of the emails were clearly intended to unsettle and distract the candidate that they were targeted at, and they were the single biggest topic about which voters in Eden-Monaro contacted the ALP campaign. We're seeing more and more around the world the spread of disinformation online influence democratic processes. There are really two connected threats here the growth of digital platforms have enabled. And the first is that hostile actors, whether it is an individual or a state-connected strategic actor, have a greater ability to sow division by weaponising controversial or misleading information and then spreading it online through technology or on digital platforms. And secondly, the self-selection of news that digital platforms has allowed has contributed to the rise of echo chambers and filter bubbles in which misinformation can spread online unchallenged. So that's the wider context in which this sort of activity is occurring. I'm not suggesting that this was anything other than the activities of one individual, and I don't believe it was connected to any institutional efforts that are domestic or external. The AFP conducted their investigation and it's making its way through the justice system and we're quite satisfied about that. But it points to the wider context that we're all grappling with and it's a shared challenge which all actors in the electoral and political system need to take very seriously, and it presented itself again in Eden-Monaro, so I thought that was just worth remarking.
Thanks for that, Paul. Excellent. We've got a whole series of questions I'm going to put to both you and Tom. And what I'll try to do is actually I'll cluster the questions and with the view to trying to cover as many of the questions as possible. I think there are a number of questions that basically go to the impact on workers of COVID-19. So if you like, rather than the voter anxiety issue, it's about the worker anxiety issue. There's a question from Damon Mueller about whether there were difficulties getting staff to staff the polling booths. But in fact, I'll extend that question whether there were difficulties from the ALP's perspective of getting workers to actually campaign, given the fear of infection. There's a related question whether, in terms of whether there was effects on the mental health of workers who actually chose to work in the COVID-19 pandemic context. And also another related question whether the pandemic meant that the level of experience that you got for the workers actually varied from pre-COVID-19. I'll leave that set of questions and I'll just put another set of questions while you'll just perhaps collect your thoughts. And the other set of questions, I think in a way comes from Paul Kildea, is really how does compulsory voting operate in the COVID-19 pandemic? And whether fear of being infected by the virus would constitute a valid or sufficient reason for not voting. Paul and Tom, in whichever order suits you.
Paul, do you want to, I think that's a great question about the workers for the parties as well. Do you want to take that one and then I'll talk from a voter worker perspective?
Yeah, sure. Given that it was a federal by-election, a very high-profile event, and of course, Eden-Monaro is a very big electorate. It's the size of the Netherlands, and it's made up of many communities, but it does have the Australian Capital Territory in the heart of it. Our experience wasn't. We didn't want for volunteers. We had the largest branch of our party was very directly engaged, and we found that there was a degree of enthusiasm to participate. Probably the bigger effect was that we had to, and I'm sure this is true of all the parties, we had to be creative about what we encourage people to do, because many of the traditional activities that volunteers or campaign staff can engage in simply weren't an option. No one's going to be holding a street stall in a shopping centre or going door knocking in this sort of environment. I think the point about mental health and about how we actually support participation in an environment where people are under a lot of duress and stress is a really important one. And this, in a sense, connects back to my earlier observations about how parties respond to some of the challenges that COVID restrictions throw up. Like, we are very much a volunteer-based organisation. We're probably the biggest difference between our engagement in the in an electoral event and that of the Commission from a human resources perspective is simply that most of the people who are contributing to the Labor Party's effort are doing it on a voluntary basis. And we don't have an employment relationship with them at all. They're essentially there of their own volition, and we have to try to guide them towards the right way to engage, and also encourage them to take care of themselves. And it was a long campaign conducted in the dead of winter in a pretty cold part of the country, and with the pandemic hanging over the top of it. So we took pains to make sure that we were regularly engaging with everyone who was involved in the campaign, doing a lot of training, a lot of pre-briefing and debriefing before campaign events, and just the same sort of very proactive kind of COVID safe measures that any employer or large organisation have been learning to incorporate into all of your business as usual over the last few months, in terms of ensuring that people get really clear signals that if you're feeling a bit unwell, you don't come in. If you're feeling a bit run down, straight off to the doctor and get a test. If you've been tested, you're isolated until you get the all clear or otherwise, etc. So,
yeah. Thanks,
from an AEC perspective, I'd back up what Paul says, probably with one twist. I think a large number of people that we get, Paul, are actually not motivated by that money either. They're actually really, really keen on the electoral process as well. So whilst they're not volunteers in the strict sense, they kind of are in a way. However, we didn't really have a significant issue in getting staff, even though we thought we would. I think maybe echoes the experience of the parties with that. We were concerned, given the information that was coming out from overseas, that was going to be difficult, particularly given the demographic of a lot of the poll workers is, generally in that vulnerable category. We did a lot of work communicating with our temporary election workforce. Our staff did a fantastic FAQ on all of the measures that we're undertaking to protect people. We really upped the communication with them quite extraordinarily. So we didn't have the sorts of issues that we actually expected to have beforehand. And, you turned up to the polling place, it was the same sort of staff that we would normally get. We had a mixture of very experienced and new, as we always do at every election. So it was very pleasing to see that. And I wonder, in part, Paul's very apt comment that it wasn't a full-blown, people weren't locked down like they are in Victoria at the moment. That probably helped, I think. And if we are delivering electoral services in the middle of a full-blown lockdown pandemic, I think that's going to be very different again. But for us at that point, we were pretty happy with the response of the workers. I did see one of the questions there, Jude, just to go further about mental health and whether there was an outbreak. We're not aware of any significant issues with mental health of workers. I can't speak for the parties, but I doubt it for them either, if I may say that. And in terms of the outbreak, there's no evidence of any outbreak as a result of the polling activities that we're aware of. So actually, we're pretty happy with the staffing approach.
Great. And I think we've got a series of questions about moving fully to postal voting. So I might get your reactions, Tom and Paul. And can I draw out some other issues with moving to postal voting? I suppose one of the questions was putting whether that might address the challenge of costs that Tom identified in terms of the by-election. But it got me thinking too that the question of cost might not pose itself in the same way for the AEC as opposed to the parties. So it'd be great for you to come in, Paul, to see whether, while we might meet the question of cost with AEC, how does it play out in terms of the parties? And I think it seems to me there's another related question, I think, linked to all this, which also connects to your comment, Paul, about laying down campaign rules for the parties, is whether the pandemic whether in terms of the mode of voting, so moving from attendance voting fully to postal voting, or the campaign rules you talk about, do they require amendments in terms of the Commonwealth Electoral Act in terms of some of these measures? Sorry, there are quite a few issues there, but I thought I'll just, to whatever extent you're able to sort of address them, because I think kind of connected in various ways. Yeah.
Well, do you mind if I start? Because I just realised I didn't answer the other question that you posed about compulsory voting, and
yeah,
just
maybe
right,
yeah.
I deal with that. Sorry for the person that asked that question. We intend to run the same process that we'd run after every election, and we will be running a non-voter process at the end. People had a lot of options to vote at that event, including Postal. So we think we'll run that process, and let's see what happens from that. Paul, did you want to take the other question about Postal, about your experience with Australia Post, and then I might come in as well.
Well, I suppose the overriding observation I would make is that I think there's a pretty clear body of evidence that decisions that voters make about the mode of voting that they'll choose to cast their ballot generally under normal conditions revolve around convenience. Now I know that there's a lot of research that the Commission has done into people's attitudes to queuing, and some very interesting stuff about how people will tolerate waiting in a queue for a certain amount of time if they've made a decision to vote early, and then their threshold for queuing is much lower if they're casting their vote by default, if you will, on polling day. But so it's certainly not sort of a one-dimensional relationship, but our thinking is always that has generally been that convenience is the biggest driver behind which mode of casting a voter will choose. What you then see come into things in the by-election is you introduce that added parameter in terms of voter anxiety around COVID. And so it ceases just to be about convenience, and it becomes also for the voter about an element of having regard for your personal safety, if you will, and that then puts the premium on the option of casting a postal vote. So our view, based on the advice that we gotten from the experience in Queensland after the March round of elections, was that due to COVID, there would be a greater level of interest in the electorate at large in postal voting. There essentially wasn't any evidence before us, and we weren't sort of interested in trying to collect any insights into what groups, what types of voters would be more interested or less interested. We just took the view that across the board, everyone's going to be more interested in casting their vote via a postal vote. And so the sorts of postal voting services that the parties traditionally offer voters in federal elections, they became a priority for us. Cost-wise, as a campaign director, you're always in a position where you don't have anywhere near the level of resources that you might like, and you don't have the level of resources that would allow you to do everything that you would like to do. So you have to triage and you have to make choices. And given the logic that I just described around where we thought voters would be, we prioritised postal voting to a degree that we might not have otherwise.
What I'd probably add is we sort of perennial argument about what people think about postal voting and pre-poll voting, and sometimes the parties have had a very different view on that. We're very cautious of advancing an opinion because sometimes it seems like we're making a political comment when we advocate for a particular channel of voting. I think what I'd probably just point out is that, I don't want to criticise Australia Post either. It's not the purpose of today, but there has been an observed, I'm searching for words here, change in the delivery model for Australia Post, which I think potentially could disadvantage some Australians. We're sort of seeing a reduction in services. I think, if I'm wrong, I apologise. I think part of that might be that there is more, as I understand it, outsourcing to contractors going on that has created some issues. costs have also gone up with postal voting as well. That's going to have an impact. So there are a range of issues, I think, with postal voting. I do understand, and as Paul just said too, for many voters, it removes the anxiety associated with voting during a pandemic. So I don't have anything else to say on that, Juchong, other than we're going to watch with interest what Parliament thinks of that and what they may actually either mandate or allow us to do as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Let me end with another set of questions that's really about, I think, and it's a theme that was picked up in Paul's presentation about social media. And I suppose if there's less face-to-face campaigning, you know, one would naturally follow that there'll be probably more campaigning in the digital space. And I suppose there's a really broad question to both of you, and I think Paul's touched upon this, is really if this is going to continue and we're going to see elections where the pandemic has a much greater impact, what are some of the key issues you see in this particular space in terms of social media campaigning?
I think this is an example of somewhere where the pandemic is accelerating some trends that were otherwise already sort of present and widely commented upon. So people are getting more and more of their information online, more and more of their engagement in news is mediated via social media platforms. And so that that means that that's a space that if you're trying to get information to consumers or to voters or out to the market, then or to citizens, depending upon your sort of perspective or who you are, then you need to be active in that space. Running counter to my point, though, what we've also seen since February is a bit of a rush back, a flight back to sort of trusted institutions, and voters also getting sort of a lot of their information from, well, their level of engagement in sort of legacy media increasing, and their sort of hunger for information about COVID and how governments are responding to it and how the rules apply to them, sort of crowding out everything else. So that, you know, that I think was sort of one of the defining conditions that applied for us in the by-election, because you just have to operate in the media environment that you're operating within. What does it mean over the medium term? Well, I think there are a lot of things about life over the last sort of 3 to 6 months that where changes have occurred, where I think there's a pretty high degree of uncertainty how much they're going to, these changes will end up being permanent, and how much will life sort of revert back to a pre-COVID mode when we ultimately arrive at a point where it's no longer sort of the defining issue of our times. But those are trends I'm not prepared to make any predictions about. We're just going to continue to observe.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. Tom?
Look, I've got nothing really to add to what Paul just said, other than we're doing exactly the same. We're watching, and I wouldn't predict. I mean, we are conscious of some of the stuff Paul said earlier on about the increase in misinformation and disinformation. We're doing far more work in that space, and we're going to continue to do that and monitor the situation.
Great. Well, that was really fabulous, really insightful and really stimulating seminar. And can you all, in your virtual ways, join me in thanking Paul and Tom for the really the privilege of being able to share their insights. I think it's just fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And our next seminar is by Senator Scott Ryan, who's the President of the Senate, and who's got direct lived experience on the topic he can speak on, which is really on a virtual parliament. In fact, that's happening as we speak, I think, over the week. So that's going to be on Wednesday, the 30th of September. And information would be co-hosted with the Gilbert and Tobin Center again, which is another great thing. And information about that seminar will go out very shortly. Thank you again, everybody, and have a good day.